For U.S. citizens, international travel typically involves a passport, visa, and an interest in experiencing other cultures. However, certain geopolitical conflicts, diplomatic policies, and security issues have led to restrictions on travel to specific countries. We're talking about countries where the U.S. government strongly advises against travel, often for your own safety. So buckle up as we take a deep dive into 10 countries where Americans are currently advised not to travel. First up, we have North Korea, a country that's less concerned with tourism and more concerned with, well, not being invaded by America mostly. The U.S. government has prohibited travel to North Korea since 2017, and for good reason. Remember Otto Warmbier? He was an American student detained in North Korea for allegedly stealing a propaganda poster, and died shortly after being released in a coma. The risks in North Korea go beyond just detention. The country has a dismal human rights record with severe restrictions on freedom of speech, religion, and movement. So unless you have a burning desire to be featured in a future episode about hostage negotiations, I'd suggest crossing North Korea off your bucket list. There are plenty of other places to see in the world where you can experience a different culture without risking your freedom. Next on our list is Iran, a country with a rich history and culture, but also with a rather complicated relationship with the United States. The U.S. government urges its citizens to reconsider travel to Iran due to the risk of arbitrary detention. The process of getting a visa is notoriously difficult for Americans, requiring letters of invitation, detailed itineraries, and a whole lot of patience. Even if you manage to get your visa, you'll still need to travel with a government-approved tour guide for your entire trip. Iran has stunning mosques, beautiful gardens, and a history that dates back millennia. But it also has a government that's not too fond of Americans, and that's not a risk worth taking, even for the gram. So, unless you have a burning desire to experience the world's most closely monitored tour group, maybe give Iran a miss for now. Let's move on to a country that's been a thorn in the side of U.S. foreign policy for decades, Cuba. It's not impossible for Americans to travel to Cuba, but it's not as simple as booking a flight and packing your bags either. While the Obama administration eased some travel restrictions, the Trump administration tightened them again. One way around the restrictions is to travel to Cuba via a third country like Mexico or Canada. Despite the challenges, Cuba remains a popular destination for adventurous Americans. But before you start packing your bags, remember that traveling to Cuba as an American comes with its own set of challenges and ethical considerations. So, if you're dead set on experiencing the Cuban time warp, do your research, travel responsibly, and maybe pack an extra suitcase for all the rum you'll be bringing back. Let's shift our attention to a country that's been ravaged by civil war for over a decade, Syria. The U.S. government has issued its highest level of travel advisory for Syria, urging Americans to avoid all travel to the country. The country is fragmented, with various factions vying for control, including the Syrian government, rebel groups, and terrorist organizations. Adding to the danger is the lack of consular support for Americans in Syria. The situation in Syria is heartbreaking, and it's understandable to feel a sense of helplessness. But the best way to help is not by putting yourself in harm's way. Instead, consider supporting reputable organizations providing humanitarian aid to the Syrian people. Our next stop takes us to South America, to a country that was once a beacon of prosperity, but has fallen into deep crisis: Venezuela. The U.S. government has issued a Level 4 travel advisory, urging Americans not to travel to Venezuela due to crime, civil unrest, and the arbitrary enforcement of local laws. Adding to the challenges is the high crime rate, particularly in urban areas. The political climate in Venezuela is also highly volatile, with frequent protests, demonstrations, and clashes between government forces and opposition groups. The U.S. government has limited ability to provide emergency services to its citizens in Venezuela, as the U.S. Embassy suspended operations in 2019. As tempting as it might be to explore the natural wonders of Venezuela, the risks far outweigh the rewards. Our next stop takes us to North Africa, to a country that's been embroiled in chaos and conflict for over a decade, Libya. The U.S. government has issued a Level 4 travel advisory, its highest warning, urging Americans not to travel to Libya. The country is awash in weapons, militias roam freely, and the threat of terrorism is ever present. Adding to the volatility is the presence of terrorist groups, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who have exploited the security vacuum to establish a foothold in Libya. The U.S. government's ability to provide assistance to Americans in Libya is extremely limited. So, unless you have a burning desire to star in your own personal action movie, with a very high chance of a tragic ending, I suggest giving Libya a wide berth. Our journey now takes us to Afghanistan, a country synonymous with conflict resilience and, most recently, a dramatic return to Taliban rule. The U.S. government has issued its highest level of travel advisory, urging Americans to avoid all travel to Afghanistan. The security situation in Afghanistan is highly volatile and unpredictable. The Taliban's takeover has resulted in a humanitarian crisis, with widespread food shortages, economic collapse, and a breakdown of law and order. The U.S. government's ability to provide assistance to Americans in Afghanistan is extremely limited, if not impossible, following the chaotic withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2021. So, unless you have a burning desire to witness history unfold from a safe distance, I suggest crossing Afghanistan off your travel list. Our next stop takes us to the Horn of Africa, to a country that's been synonymous with piracy, famine, and conflict for decades, Somalia. The United States government has issued its highest level of travel advisory, urging Americans to avoid all travel to Somalia. The country has been ravaged by civil war for over 3 decades, resulting in a collapse of government institutions, widespread lawlessness, and a devastating humanitarian crisis. Adding to the danger is the ever-present threat of terrorism. Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist group, has been waging a brutal insurgency in Somalia for years. The United States government's ability to provide assistance to Americans in Somalia is extremely limited, so, unless you have a burning desire to meet a real-life pirate and not the fun Disneyland kind, I suggest giving Somalia a wide berth. Our journey takes us now to Southeast Asia, to a country that was once a beacon of hope for democracy, but has sadly fallen back into the grip of military rule, Myanmar, also known as Burma. The United States government has issued its highest level of travel advisory, urging Americans to avoid all travel to Myanmar. The military junta has unleashed a brutal crackdown on dissent, killing hundreds of protesters, arresting thousands more, and silencing independent media. The military junta has shown a blatant disregard for human rights, and travelers face the very real risk of arbitrary arrest, detention, and abuse. By visiting Myanmar, you'd be indirectly supporting a regime that's brutally suppressing its own people. So, unless you have a burning desire to witness a military coup firsthand, which, let's be honest, sounds like a terrible vacation, I suggest crossing Myanmar off your travel list for now. Our final stop takes us to a country that's been synonymous with conflict, instability, and the devastating human cost of war for decades, Iraq. The United States government has issued a Level 4 travel advisory, its highest warning, urging Americans to avoid all travel to Iraq. While the security situation in Iraq has improved somewhat in recent years, the country is still a long way from being safe for tourists. The threat of terrorism remains high, particularly in Baghdad and other major cities. Adding to the danger is the presence of militias and armed groups, many of which are not under the control of the Iraqi government. The United States government's ability to provide assistance to Americans in Iraq is extremely limited. So, unless you have a burning desire to see bombed-out buildings and military checkpoints, which, let's be honest, sounds like a terrible vacation, I suggest crossing Iraq off your travel list for now. So, guys, this was the 10 countries where Americans are not allowed. While Americans can travel to a vast majority of countries around the world, some destinations pose unique challenges and dangers, leading to restrictions or outright bans. The world is a big, beautiful, and often messy place, and sometimes, the responsible thing to do is to admire its complexity from afar. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon for the latest upcoming travel videos. Bye-bye, see you.